And in this video, we take a look at a collection of bizarre and suspicious sightings surrounding the deaths of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe.
Hello. Hello, police. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. The following police statement is from the 15th of December 1995, and it was given by Andrew Joseph Kowalensky. He states the following. I'm employed by the Dental Practice Board as a dental reference officer. My work involves a great deal of travelling around the Essex area. In the course of my work, I examine various patients at different clinics in Essex. I basically examine the work carried out by dental practitioners. I drive a white Peugeot 405 Saloon, index Mike 820 Juliet Papa Juliet. On Tuesday, the 5th of December 1995, I travelled to Stowmarket to the health clinic situated at Violet Hill Road. I was with my partner Norma Ainsworth. We worked there until lunchtime and then we drove back to a temporary residence at Stone Farm, Little Connard, Sudbury. We then stayed at the farm till about 17:30 hours, then we drove to the Holiday Inn at King's Cross, London, where we booked in and stayed the night. We had not intended to stay at King's Cross. It was just that the weather was bad, it was snowing and the roads were icy. I was concerned that I would not be able to reach my destination at St Christopher House, a government building at Southwark Road, the following morning. I knew if I left in the morning my journey would have been very difficult. On Wednesday the 6th of December 95, from around 9 AM till 5 PM, we stayed at St Christopher House. It was our intention to then travel back to Sudbury. Having left there, we approached the Brentwood area. Sometime later, I would think around 8 PM to 8:15 PM, the weather was worsening, and because I knew I had a work session at Basildon Great Oaks Clinic, we decided to obtain overnight accommodation at the Travelodge on the A127 at East Horndon. They had no vacancies, so we went and ate in the Little Chef next to it. We were still looking for accommodation at that time and left at around 7:30 PM. I paid for our meal with my NatWest Switch card. We left and drove to the Watermill Travelodge in Basildon. En route there we saw another place, the Campanile Hotel. We stopped there, tried to obtain accommodation, but they were full. We continued to the Watermill Travelodge. Again, they were full up. We made the decision to go back to Sudbury and stay overnight. On the way back, we travelled through Wickford, heading in the general direction of Chelmsford. Somewhere along that road we stopped at a Toby Inn. I don't know the name of the place, but I would describe it as a large building set back from the road with a large driveway and car park. They were also full. The time now was around 8 PM and it was still snowing. We then decided to carry on to Sudbury. As I recall, we drove up the A130 and followed the signs to Chelmsford. We were now travelling along at a speed of around 20 to 25 miles per hour due to the bad weather. I had my headlamps on and my windscreen wipers working. The snow was falling and settling and I had to take care driving. At the time I was wearing spectacles, which I always do when I am driving. I am mildly short-sighted. Norma was seated in the front passenger seat. As we drove along the A130, I'm not sure at the time of making this statement at exactly what point along the road, but I saw a man who I will describe further on. I think I'd been travelling for around 10 or 15 minutes from our last stop at the Toby Inn. The first I saw of the man was some movement from my right-hand side. I'd been basically looking ahead, and I remember seeing the man to my front and over to my right side. Looking back, I think I may have been travelling on the left-hand bend, but I cannot be certain. I know I only saw the man very briefly, about a second or two, and I had passed by him very quickly. I am certain he had come off of a field close to the road. I saw him at a point where he had stopped running and had just started walking. He was now walking at right angles towards the road from the field. It was still snowing. At that point I did not see him again. I do not know where he went. There were other cars in the area, but the traffic was fairly light. I did not see any persons or vehicles in particular. My initial reaction, having seen the man, was I thought it was strange. I wondered why he had come from that direction, the field. When I noticed what he was wearing, I thought about saying something to Norma, as I thought this strange also. But I felt that I wouldn't, because I thought she might react by saying that it's not unusual seeing someone dressed like that on a cold winter night. I would describe the man as being not noticeably large or small. I would say around 5'8" to 6 foot. He wore a dark balaclava, but I think he was white and there was a definite contrast of colour between the balaclava and his face. The balaclava could have been any dark colour. It covered all of his head apart from his eyes, nose and mouth. I can only say that his clothing may have been a short jacket. I got the impression that it may have been padded or something. I think he was of medium build. I could not see if he was carrying anything. I didn't notice his footwear. I seem to recall seeing his swinging arms alongside him in a position where his body and posture was indicative of him just having stopped running and slowing down to a walk. I cannot describe the colour of his clothes. I cannot remember anything distinctive about him. I would estimate he was in my view for a second or two at a distance of around 20 feet. My view was restricted obviously due to the snow. As far as I recall, there was no street lighting on that stretch of road. Where I saw him, I also remember the road was bendy. In relation to the man, my impression was that he was a young adult. His posture was certainly not that of a child or elderly person. Since that night, I have heard about the murders at Rettendon. The following day, Thursday the 7th of December 95, Norma and I travelled back on the A130 to Basildon when we saw a lot of police activity on the roadside near Rettendon. I assumed there had been a car crash. We continued to Basildon. It was later in the day that we heard on the radio about people being killed. I remember Norma spoke to me telling me some men had been shot in Chelmsford. It was then that I mentioned what I had seen to Norma. We discussed over the next few days as to whether I should contact the police or not. I was not certain as to how much use it would be because I didn't see much detail, but eventually reported the matter. I'm willing to give evidence at court if required. Further to the above, I remember I'd been listening to a football match on the radio in the car, which was Blackburn in a European Cup match, and at the time I passed through the road where I saw the man, it was near the end of the first half of the match. The following statement is from Alan Grayston, dated the 29th of December 1995. I am the above described and I live at the address Overleaf. I am employed as a commercial director of Haven Freight Services Limited at 212 High Road, South Benfleet, Essex. On Monday the 4th of December 1995, I was travelling from my home address at Felixstowe to our work premises in South Benfleet. My route took me along the A130 between Chelmsford and Rayleigh, Essex. Just past the premises and the land of White House Farm, Rettendon, I saw a white 3 Series BMW parked in a bridle walk on the near side at the bottom of the hill. Since reading about the murders of the 3 males at an area in Rettendon, I have seen flowers laid on the ground beside the entrance from the A130 to the same bridleway. The BMW was reversed into the entrance of this bridleway, but was jutting out onto the road and caused both myself and the vehicle in front of me to make a slight diversion around it. The vehicle in front was an Amtrak 12-metre articulated lorry with a curtain-sided trailer on the rear. The BMW was not occupied. It was a square-shaped vehicle and probably around 6 or 7 years old. It was very clean and polished and well looked after. As I passed the vehicle up the hill, I saw a male person who was walking down the field on the near side from the direction of the large house on the hill towards the bridleway. He was around 20 yards into the field, and I saw him through an opening in the perimeter fence from the road. The fence is a triple bar wooden fence, and some parts you can see through. I noticed him in particular because we made eye contact. He looked straight at me. I was only travelling at around 5 miles per hour, having just passed a white BMW. It appeared he was walking towards this vehicle. I would describe him as follows: white-skinned European, 5'10" to 5'11", well-built and fit-looking, early to mid-30s, short cropped dark brown hair. He had a striking resemblance to a well-known footballer called Steve Ball of Wolverhampton Wanderers in both looks and build. He had either a designer stubble or a few days' growth on his face. He was wearing a military-style khaki officer's jumper and a tanned leather pair of heavy lace-up boots, which came to around 4 to 5 inches above the ankle. These are what dockers or riggers would normally wear. He had a white t-shirt which could be seen above the collar line of the jumper. He was holding a pair of binoculars in his left hand, which were in the case. The case was dark in colour. I did not see where he went as I carried on my journey. I would recognise this male again, and I am willing to attend court if required. Okay, so why do I believe that this statement is of any importance, or at least quite interesting? Well, for me, I guess the fact that this eyewitness account originates just 2 days before the deaths of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. What I also find interesting is that although it doesn't actually mention what time this sighting occurred, I would imagine it was sometime during the morning as this guy was heading towards work. Now, if this is in fact during the daylight hours or during the daytime, then this gate where the Range Rover was parked in front, this gate would have in fact been open during this time period. And if this was someone scoping out the crime scene, potentially using those binoculars positioned high up on that hill looking down towards the lane below, possibly checking the comings and goings of that lane, he would have noticed that gate was in fact open. Now, does this somehow tie in with Darren Nicholls' version of events, where he claims that Michael Steele said to him that he was travelling down in the Range Rover before the murders took place, and he was shocked that the gate was locked when they travelled there before the gate had been open. When Michael Steele started travelling down the lane and he realised this gate was locked, he became panicked. He didn't know where Jack Womes was going to be waiting. So could this somehow tie in with the fact that they did supposedly expect this gate to be open during the time of these murders? Now, for me, what tells me this isn't Jack Womes, who is perched on this hill, or walking towards that white BMW, I should say, is the fact that this guy appears quite a bit shorter, sort of 5'10" to 5'11", whereas Jack Womes was well over 6 feet tall, quite an imposing figure. Now, another point worthy of mention is the fact that Jack Womes was supposedly in the area of Rettendon on December the 5th, so the day after this eyewitness account took place. Now, that's not to say that he was actually in Rettendon or even down the lane, so do just bear that in mind. It's important for us to remember that these estimations regarding the phone masts were just that, they were estimations. Any time that he was picked up on a mast, it could only really tell where he was within a sort of 10 to 15 mile radius. But could this have been someone who was attending this crime scene on the 4th of December, possibly scoping it out, as I say, checking the comings and goings, and really just looking for the perfect place to commit this triple murder? Something else I'd like to talk about is the white vehicle, the white BMW. Not so much the vehicle itself, but the way in which this vehicle was left or parked. Now, we get the impression that this vehicle belonged to the guy who was seen in the field as he was walking back towards that vehicle. And the way it's been parked tells me, or gives me the impression at least, that this vehicle wasn't going to be there for very long. This was a passing visit. This was literally get out of the car, go into the field, check what they needed to check, then get back into the vehicle and drive away. That's the sort of impression that I get from reading this statement. It's also worth remembering that this may have simply just been a farmer or someone who was out hunting, someone potentially connected to White House Farm or Rettendon Hall, the large house on top of that hill. But I guess what we can all agree on is that if you are going to commit a triple murder, it's going to take a great deal of preparation and planning, especially if it's premeditated murder. So you would have expected whoever committed this crime to have visited the crime scene on the days leading up to the actual murder itself. Now, there wouldn't really be any point in attending that scene in the evening hours or the hours of darkness, because you wouldn't get a great idea of where things were situated or located. You would need to visit that area during the daylight hours, even if you plan for the murder to take place in the evening. So to me, to see or to hear of someone potentially scoping out that crime scene during the daylight hours isn't to shock him. I would expect at least whoever committed this crime to have paid a visit during the daylight hours to this crime scene and to this lane to check either the comings and goings, as I said earlier, or where certain things were situated. Now, a few things to remember before we conclude this video is that a lot of people will say, well, this is an incredibly detailed statement, but it's worth remembering that this guy was just driving past the scene at around 5 miles per hour. It's also worth remembering that this is probably a route that he did quite frequently, and what he saw actually stood out as being out of the ordinary. Also worth remembering that he would have come across the news reports when the 3 men were found dead in the Range Rover, and this may well have jogged his memory as to what he saw on December the 4th. As I say, I certainly believe it's possible that someone would have scoped out this crime scene and would have attended this crime scene or the area they killed Tucker, Tate and Rolfe in the days leading up to these murders. Now, the man who gave this eyewitness account, Mr. Alan Grayston, was very clear as to what he saw on that morning of December the 4th, 1995. It's obviously impossible to say whether it had any connection with the deaths of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, but this guy was clearly adamant as to what he witnessed during that drive and was even willing to stand up in court if required. The following statement is from Kevin Tarbuck, dated the 14th of the 12th, 1995. I work for Sutcliffe Industrial Services Limited, who at present have a contract at Hanningfield Water Treatment Works. When I finish work, I leave the site and turn right onto the A130 towards Southend. I've been working on that site for around 5 weeks and have travelled along that road every evening during that period. At around 19:40 hours on Wednesday the 6th of the 12th, 95, I finished work and started my journey home. As I approached Rettendon along the A130, I had just passed White House Farm on the left-hand side and was approaching a small lane again on the left-hand side. As I got nearer to the lane, a white Ford Escort van emerged from the lane and turned left towards Rettendon in front of me. I only saw it had one male person in the vehicle who was driving. The reason I remember this is that in pulling out in front of me, it had caused me to brake, and because it was icy and snowing, I thought what an idiot he was. The vehicle then accelerated away from me. I followed, but by the time I'd reached the Rettendon Turnpike, the van was nowhere to be seen. I would think that the van was a D or E registration due to the style of the vehicle. I would not be able to identify the driver again. I would estimate the time that this happened would be around 1950 hours. At the time of the incident, it was dark and snowing. I had my windscreen wipers on and my headlights. In spite of these conditions, visibility was fairly good. There was no other vehicle immediately in front of me nor behind me. If the van had waited for me to pass, he could have pulled out without affecting anybody. The vehicle was in my sight for around 15 seconds and the nearest I was to it was around 30 yards. Okay, now this is one of the more odd eyewitness accounts. This isn't a white vehicle as in a Ford Sierra, a Cosworth or any sort of white type sports car being seen with the Range Rover on the day or the evening of their deaths. This is a white transit van, quite an old one, around the 85 or 86 year registration. And what's interesting about this actual statement is the fact that this guy probably isn't from the actual area of Rettendon or maybe even Essex, but he's been travelling on that exact road every single day for the past 5 weeks. So you have to believe that he's become incredibly familiar with that road. He knows with White House Farm on the left-hand side and also the little tucked away farm track just on the left-hand side past White House Farm. Now, why this actual eyewitness account is interesting in itself is the fact that this vehicle is driving in what you would class as a bit of a careless or erratic or possibly even nervous manner. Now, this occurs at around 7:50 p.m. on the evening of their deaths. Now, the official narrative is that Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were killed between 6:48 and 6:58 p.m. on December the 6th, 1995. But what's actually drawn my attention to this statement in particular is the fact that in some ways it does actually mirror Darren Nicholls' version of events for being the getaway driver when he pulls out of Workhouse Lane back onto the main road. An incident occurs in both of these instances. This statement from this man who was travelling from Hanningfield Water Treatment Works, and also Darren Nicholls' version of events and his statement under oath and also his book Blogs 19, where he describes a similar event occurring. So firstly, let's take a look at Darren Nicholls' statement under oath. Mick had shut the door of the car and said, "Let's get going." He said to go left towards the Rettendon Turnpike, so I pulled out. Something clicked in my mind that something had happened. I pulled out in front of a car. Mick asked if I was okay. I said yes I was, and we drove up the road towards the Rettendon Turnpike. Now let's take a look at a passage from the book Blogs 19 by Tony Thompson, where Darren Nicholls is recalling the same event. Mick told me to get going, and though my mind was elsewhere, my body somehow obeyed, putting the car into gear and moving off towards the main road. From then on, everything happened in slow motion. I saw the headlights, heard the screech of tyres, and braced myself for impact. But it never came. Mick had grabbed the steering wheel at the last moment and wrenched it to one side, avoiding a crash by just a few inches. The other driver flashed his lights and swore at me out of his half-open window. I just pulled out onto a main road without looking, but I honestly didn't know where I was or what I was doing. I just sat there like a zombie. Okay, now I know a few of you watching this video are immediately going to jump to the conclusion that it may have been Darren Nicholls driving this Ford Escort van, and he pulled out in front of this unsuspecting motorist. But that isn't actually the case, because Darren Nicholls' mobile phone was picked up on either the Marks Tate or the Basildon transmitter during the time that this eyewitness account actually happened. So we can pretty much discredit the fact that this was Darren Nicholls driving the Escort van and pulling out in front of this motorist. But so why is this even important? Why is this eyewitness account even relevant to the story of the murders of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe? The reason I find it important and actually relevant is the fact that it's almost as if Darren Nicholls is recalling events told to him. When you look at Darren Nicholls' statement in its entirety, certain aspects of his statement have a lot of detail. You know, for instance, when they were at the pub with Jack and Mick and they're about to pull off to head towards Rettendon, Darren Nicholls adds in little details such as, we got out to change the number plates, I got my feet wet, I got back in the vehicle, we had to put the heater on because the windows were misting up because it was so cold outside. He adds little elements of detail to add further credibility to what he is exactly saying. But then there's other elements of his story which are completely lacking in detail, which you would have thought would have been remembered if you were actually there during that time period, such as the calls between Michael Steele and Jack Womes after 6 p.m. These two phone calls, which definitely occurred, I believe one was around 20 seconds and one was just under a minute long, go completely unmentioned by Darren Nicholls, despite the fact that he tells us that he was in the company of Jack Womes during this time period. Just to make it a little bit simpler, a lot of his statement actually has a lot of detail, but it's completely irrelevant detail, which adds credibility to the story he is actually telling. Whereas other events which could have proven with a great deal of certainty that he was actually there during this time period, such as the phone calls and recalling that these phone calls actually took place between Steele and Womes, go completely unmentioned. To get a real understanding of exactly what I am saying here, let's quickly revisit Darren Nicholls' version of events for December the 6th, and let's pick out some areas in which he is quite vague and others in which I believe he adds additional detail in order to add credibility to his version of events. I went through Rettendon the latter part of 1995. I remember an occasion when I was there with other people. They were Jack Womes and Michael Steele. I remember that day. I was working at Sunbury-on-Thames. My mobile phone was with me. Michael Steele rang me that day and he wondered where I was and said he'd like to meet me. We did not discuss where we'd meet because I was at work. I agreed to meet him later on that day at Ron Parkinson's Motorcycles at Marks Tate at 5 p.m. I drove to Marks Tate and I think my Golf convertible. I've been to Ron Parkinson's before. It sells motorcycles. When I arrived, I parked in the flats opposite. Mr. Steele wasn't there when I arrived. When I arrived, I went into the motorbike shop and I bought something for my old motorbike. It was either a battery or a light bulb. I then put it in my car. Right, so let's just cut in here very quickly. First of all, he can't remember, but he believes it was the Golf convertible that he was driving to go and meet them. Now, my first thought when reading that is that if I'd been involved or yeah, basically involved in a triple murder, as in I was an unwitting getaway driver, the first thing I'm going to remember is exactly what I was driving that evening. So he's a little bit vague here with I think I was driving my Golf convertible. And then it starts to get even more vague when he can't remember if it was a battery or a light bulb that he purchased from the motorbike shop. Now, why would he be so vague? Let's just play devil's advocate here for a moment. Is this because he didn't have a receipt to prove that he was actually there, that he actually purchased anything? So in order to muddy the waters, he said either a battery or a light bulb, really so that it couldn't be traced back to him, so that he couldn't really, be proven to be telling a lie. I mean, if he said, for instance, I went there and I purchased a battery, they went there and they looked at the till receipts and there was no one purchasing a battery around that time, it's going to look a little bit strange. Whereas a light bulb is a commonly bought item, probably more so, or a lot more so than a battery would have been. And they probably sell, obviously, a lot more light bulbs than they do batteries. So is that why he chucked in the light bulb, for instance, so that they could possibly check the till rolls, check that he was actually there during that time period? These two instances of vagueness are quite interesting because, I mean, I can only speak for myself personally, but I certainly would have remembered the actual car that I was driving when I became a getaway driver for a triple murder. Now, what I would like to know is, did the police and the investigators of this case actually go to the occupiers of the flats where Darren Nicholls said he parked the vehicle? Did they actually go and speak to these people to see if a Golf convertible was parked there during that time, on that day? I don't have any record at all of anyone claiming to see a Golf convertible parked outside these flats. That's not to say that it didn't happen, but did the police take these steps necessary to actually back up and prove Darren Nicholls' version of events? Did Darren Nicholls say, well, I believe I was driving a Golf convertible that day? Is he kind of hedging his bets here just in case they do actually take those steps to check with the occupiers and it comes back that the vehicle was never seen? You need to remember this was around 5:30 in the evening. People were finishing work. There may well have been witnesses that could have backed up Darren Nicholls' version of events, saying that there was, in fact, a convertible parked there during that time period. But we don't have any record or any eyewitness accounts to back up what Darren Nicholls is claiming. Whilst I was walking back to my car, I saw Mick. I waved to him and said I was just putting something in my car. And then I got in his pickup truck. The pickup truck was a red Toyota. It was an M registration, I think. When I got in, I sat in the passenger seat. He said they were going down to do a deal with Pat, him and Jack. I said, where is Jack? He said he'll be here in a minute. I don't recall anything else he said. Then I noticed Jack had pulled up behind us. Jack was in a beige Volkswagen. It was a B registration. I had sold the car to Michael Steele. When he pulled up, he got out and spoke to Mick. I don't recall what was said. Then he got back in his car. Then we pulled off onto the A12 heading towards London. I was with Mick in his Toyota and Jack behind us in his Volkswagen. I can't recall exactly what was said, but he said we would meet Pat and there was going to be a drug deal, or we were having a drug deal, I can't remember. So what we get in this section of the statement is some more vagueness. Now, you can't really put too much emphasis on this, as you may well not have recalled exactly what was said, but the impression that you get when reading this statement is that it's almost as if it's really been laid out to be as simple as possible so that really you can't make any mistakes when you're recalling the events which happened. What we need to remember is that we're not talking about someone trying to recall events which happened a year, 5 or 10 years after the event. He was asked to recall these events just months after the triple murder occurred. Yet so far he's not entirely sure what car he was driving. He doesn't know what he purchased from the motorbike shop. He has no idea what the conversation was in the car. And really, this is just the start of the actual statement itself. Let's continue from where we left off. At that time, I didn't know where we were going. Mick said Jack would show me where a deal was going to be. He said, did I know this place? And I said, I'm not sure. He said, don't worry, Jack will show you where to go. Nothing happened on the journey, just normal chat. He told me I was going to swap cars and I was going to get in the car with Jack and he was going to meet Pat on his own. We stopped in a lay-by near the Halfway House, which is a pub restaurant on the A127. When we stopped in the lay-by, I got in the car with Jack. Mick was going to the Halfway House with Jack, We got as far as the end of the lay-by gates and we swapped drivers. Jack was to swap number plates, I got my feet wet. Jack was wearing overalls and wellies. I remember the wellies more than the overalls because they were new. When we stopped, Jack got out to stick the new number plates over the existing plates, but they wouldn't stick as it was too wet. I saw the number plates he was trying to stick and they were B registration as well, and they were also brand new. When the plates couldn't be stuck, they were put in the back of the car. He then said to drive down to the halfway house pub. I'd been to the pub only as a child or driving past on the way to Southend. Now during this section of the statement we have the added detail being put in to the story. Now in my opinion, and it is my own personal opinion, I'm not trying to persuade anyone here, but I believe that these little pieces of detail are added in order to add credibility to the version of events being told by Darren Nicholls. If you are reading this or if you are hearing this in court, the added details such as I got my feet wet, the number plates wouldn't stick because they were too wet, I've been past this pub as a child or on my way to Southend, these little additional details which don't actually add anything to the actual story, but they do give a sense of credibility to what he is actually saying. And as I said, this is my own personal opinion. I'm not trying to persuade anyone here, but I believe that these details are actually added on purpose in order to create the illusion that the events which Darren Nicholls is describing are actually completely factual. Now, I'm not saying that Darren Nicholls is lying wholeheartedly here, but I certainly believe that the way he actually mentions and talks about the events of December the 6th cannot, in my personal opinion, be truthful. When we got to the pub, Jack told me to park at the back as far away from the A127 as possible, which I did. I could see Mick's Toyota parked in front of us to the left. After we parked, Jack changed his mind and said, no, don't park here, park closer to the A127. So I moved the car. I could still see the Hilux, which was in front again but to my right. Then we had to leave the car running because the windows were misting up because of the weather. I said, shall we have a drink? And Jack said no. Then he said we were waiting for Pat to arrive and then we were going to go to a meeting point. Shortly after this time he said, right, go. Okay, now this section again, the adding in of the windows being misted up because of the weather outside, we had to put the heaters on. I could still see the vehicle to my right, then to my left. Personally, I believe, especially when it comes to the demisting of the windows, the little details are added here, in my personal opinion, just to add credibility to Darren Nicholls' version of events. Let's continue with the statement. I saw a dark-coloured Range Rover when he said that. The Range Rover drove and parked next to Mickey's Hilux. I couldn't see who was in the Range Rover. Jack then told me to drive off up the slip road by the pub and back down the A127 to Southend. So that is what I did. Then he gave me directions down the A127 and onto the A130 to Chelmsford, I think, which I am familiar with. The A130 goes from the A127 all the way to Chelmsford, but we went to the Rettendon Turnpike, which is a roundabout with traffic lights on it. I went straight over to carry on towards Chelmsford on the other side of Rettendon Turnpike and up the hill and then back down the hill and out the other side. Jack then said slow down and take the next right, which I did. It was a lane, not a road. Then I turned left into a gap to turn the car around. The headlamps were facing the road back towards the A130. Jack told me he'd ring me when he wanted me to pick him up. I had my mobile phone with me. He got out and had a bag and a coat from the back. The bag I think was a canvas, sausage-shaped bag. I didn't notice it in the car before. I might have done, but it didn't register. He told me he would ring me when he wanted me to pick him up. So I pulled off and went right towards Chelmsford. Important point to remember here is that nowhere in any eyewitness accounts or eyewitness statements is there mention of a Passat pulling into that lane. There's no mention of headlights being seen down that lane pointing back towards Main Road, or any visible eyewitness account of a Passat turning in or out of Workhouse Lane. Let's now continue. I drove down the road to the first point I could turn around to a petrol station. Then I drove back up the road and parked in a pub on the left hand side of the road. I left the engine running and checked my phone to see I had a lousy signal, so I moved to get a better signal up the road. The pub I was in had a bright pink Morris Minor. The next pub I parked in past the lane and up the hill and took the first left turn. I went up that road, turned around, first left up there, then came up and parked outside the first house on my left and waited for him to ring. I didn't wait there very long. My phone rang. Jack said come and pick us up, and I hung up. I think I might have said okay. I turned right, went back down the road and had to wait for a few cars to go past so I could turn right into the lane. Then I turned the car round to face the road again. I didn't see anyone, and after a short period of time the back opened up and Jack got in. I didn't notice the interior light come on. Okay, so he mentions here that he's had to hold up traffic in order to cut across and go back down the lane, yet no eyewitness reports have come, no one actually came forward to say, yeah, I stopped to let a Passat go down the lane. Especially, just imagine the next morning when you wake up, you were driving home from work, you were driving along that road, you saw someone entering that lane. It's not a normal, residential turn-in. It's a turning down a little small farm track. You're going to remember seeing a vehicle turn down that track around that sort of time. You have to remember that this crime, this murder, was incredibly big news, especially in the local area. And people that were passing would have seen this Passat holding up the traffic, cutting across the other line of traffic and heading down the lane, because the next morning on the news and everywhere else in the newspapers, 3 men have been shot dead with a shotgun in a Range Rover. Oh yeah, Christ, I saw a vehicle turning down there last night. Not one person came forward to say, I saw a Passat that evening, I was held up by a Passat. No one, not a single person, which I find incredibly strange. Anyway, let's now continue. I then said, where's Mick? He said he won't be a minute, he's dropped something. Jack was sitting between the back seats talking to me. Then Mick opened the passenger door of the car and the interior light came on. When the light came on, I was looking at Jack. I noticed he had surgical gloves on and I saw something on him like blood. Mick said, turn the interior light off. Mick had shut the door around the same time. Then he said, let's get going. He said, go left towards the Rettendon Turnpike, so I pulled out. Something clicked in my mind that something had happened. I pulled out in front of a car. Mick asked if I was okay. I said yes I was, and we just drove up towards the Rettendon Turnpike. Mick said they won't fuck with us no more. And Jack said yeah, it was quite funny because when Mick had shot one of them, the gun fell apart. He kept asking me if I was okay several times. I realised what had happened, but not to who. So I said I hope I don't fall out with you two. Mick said no, you won't fall out with us. Mick started to hand over to Jack parts of the gun. I saw the barrels. I don't know the names of the other parts, but I definitely saw the barrels. I was driving, I was a bit confused at the time. From the Rettendon Turnpike, we went back down the A130 to Southend. Then at the roar of traffic lights, I turned left. Straight to the bottom of that road, we turned right, and then took another right turn on or 2 roads later. Now this is another part of Darren Nicholls' version of events which interests me greatly, and that is because he goes into a great detail regarding the route he actually took after exiting the lane. I went down the road, I took the first left, I went over the traffic lights, went round the roundabout 4 times, took the third exit, took a right, took a left, went down that hill, over the traffic lights, round another roundabout. He's almost giving you the impression that he has complete clarity of mind at this point, but it's worth remembering that only 30 seconds earlier he was in a complete trance and he pulled out in front of another motorist. He didn't really know what was going on, he didn't know what to say. As he put it in the book Blogs 19, he was in a zombie sort of trance-like state. Yet 30 seconds later, he's able to tell you exactly what route he took, the roads that he took, the turns that he took, where he went over the roundabout. He's able to give you a great deal of information. What I'm trying to say is, at this point in time, it appears that he has complete clarity of mind and is able to recall all of these turns that he took. Yet if we just go back to the beginning of the statement, he couldn't remember what happened during conversations with Steele and Jack. He was quite vague during that part of his statement. But after the event, and after even admittedly saying he was in a trance-like confused state, 30 seconds after that point, he is able to completely give you a really sort of clear idea of exactly where he turned, where he went, and basically exactly what happened 30 seconds after being in a complete daze. That is what I find a little bit odd. Let's now continue. As we went up the road, there was a pub on the right, the Hungry Horse or Hungry Hippo, something like that. I drove into the car park of the pub and parked next to Mick's Toyota, which was on the left, and stopped the car. They got out and I was still sitting there. Mick had opened up his Toyota, He told me to go and get in the Toyota, which I did. Then they were getting changed sort of thing. Mick was taking off his wellies and overalls off over his wellies, then slipping his shoes on. Boiler suit and wellies were put in the pickup truck, and Jack did the same. Then we drove off. Mick drove the Hilux with me in the passenger seat, and Jack was behind us in the Passat. We drove past the Rettendon lane. Then Jack overtook us on the dual carriageway as we were driving slower. There was some conversation in the car with Mr. Steele. He said Jack was a very cold-hearted person. I said, why? He said, first of all, they'd stopped down the lane and the gate had been shut. So I got out of the Range Rover and I didn't know where Jack was. Then Jack leant into the Range Rover and shot all three of them. Jack handed Mick a gun and Mick shot them. Then he said once that had happened, Jack reloaded his gun and shot them all in the back of the head. I can't recall anything else that was said. I did say, can we stop and have a drink? Mick originally said yes, good idea, as Mick looked shaken up. But when we got to Mark's Tay, he said we'd best get home straight away. Then I got in my car and headed back to Braintree. Now, as many of you will be aware, ballistic testing was done, and in the eyes of the ballistic experts, only one gun fired the shots which killed Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. Interestingly, Darren Nicholls' version of events mentions two guns, and one gun actually firing shots against these victims, or into these victims I should say, before the gun breaks. And that is important because it shows the usage of two firearms and not one, which we know is incorrect. I don't believe that one gun fell apart and someone was fumbling around for the bits in the pitch black. I simply believe that this was added, another piece of detail, another sort of visual piece of detail, in order to really add a little bit more credibility to Darren Nicholls' version of events. So what is the purpose of today's video, and what is it that I'm exactly trying to say here? I personally believe that there's a possibility, however small that possibility may be, that Darren Nicholls is actually reciting someone else's involvement in this crime. Is it a pure coincidence that Darren Nicholls mentions pulling out in front of an unsuspecting motorist from a small farm track, and a member of the public comes forward and actually really describes the same thing but in a different vehicle? It wasn't a Volkswagen Passat which pulled out onto Main Road, but a Ford Escort van. We also have the type of weapon which was used. I mean, you may be saying to yourself, but how could Darren Nicholls know all of this information? He was just a driver. He didn't have any involvement with anyone else. He was just with Mick and Jack. They did the crime. That's how he knew all the details. The problem is some of the details he gives us are incorrect. Why would Mick and Jack mention a gun falling apart which couldn't have possibly fallen apart after it fired shots, because there was only one gun used in the crime? How can we explain the fact that he didn't know what car he was driving when he was the unsuspecting getaway driver in a triple murder? Some parts of Darren Nicholls' statement appear quite believable and quite truthful in places, but you could also perceive it as information which he has either been fed or stories which he had been told regarding how this crime was committed. But where would he have got that information from? That's probably what you're asking yourself. It's important to remember that Darren Nicholls was involved with not one, but two corrupt officers. And it's certainly not beyond the realms of possibility that these two corrupt officers knew details of that crime which weren't publicly released, such as phone records, such as witness statements of people coming forward at a later date describing what they had seen, what they had heard. Just imagine if that information, that supposedly sensitive private information, had got back to those two corrupt officers. It's quite possible that Darren Nicholls may have picked up or been fed some of that information. How do we explain that not one eyewitness account come forward and said that they saw a VW Passat turning into or exiting Workhouse Lane? How do we explain the lack of VW Passat tyre tracks entering or exiting the lane? The following statement is from Stephen Rogers, dated the 13th of December 1995. I live at 9 acres, Rettendon Common, Essex. I would describe my home as a detached dwelling with 3/4 of an acre of land containing 4 stables. We are in a valley surrounded by fields, situated to the west of the A130 and west of the Wheatsheaf Public House. At this time, there are 3 horses and a foal in our stables. The foal is being weaned off its mother and therefore requires to be fed at all times of the day and night. I can say that it is not uncommon to hear gunshots during the day and early evening in this area, although I am not a shooting person and I do not possess a gun. During the evening of Wednesday the 6th of December 1995, I was working in our village hall where I finished at 22:45 hours, returning home by 2300. I then had a sandwich and 2 cans of beer before going out to the stable to feed the foal. I would estimate the time to be 23:45 hours. I have to mix the food, feed the animal and wait for the foal to finish, which normally takes around half an hour. On this occasion, I've given the foal some food and given some attention to the other horses. I would estimate the time to be about midnight or a few minutes later. I was standing outside the stable when I heard a series of gunshots. These shots, I believe, came from a southerly direction. I walked to the fence at the rear of the stables trying to see where these shots could have come from. I saw nothing. Although it was cold and very late, if I had just heard 2 shots, I wouldn't have taken much notice. I would have thought it was someone out shooting rabbits. The gunshots I heard were more than 2 in number, and they were of rapid fire. A fusillade of shots. There was no pause to reload in between these shots, and they were rapid in succession. I couldn't say how many shots there were. I heard 2 shots, I expected the noise to stop, but it just continued. After these shots, I didn't hear anything else. I remained out at the stables for around 10 minutes before returning to my home. As I walked inside in the light of my hallway, I checked my wristwatch and the time was midnight. I didn't think any more about these gunshots until I heard people shooting in the area over the weekend. This prompted me to remember the unusual noise I had heard on Wednesday night, and I reported the matter to the police. Okay, so firstly, to talk about this particular statement and how feasible I believe this is, let's just bring up exactly where this 9 acres in Rettendon is located. You can see on the map here that it's just under, literally just under a mile away from 9 acres to where the Range Rover was situated down Workhouse Lane. Now, although you see the measurement there in kilometres, if you convert that into miles, you'll see that it's literally just a shade under a mile in length. Now, why that's of any real particular importance at all is the fact that when the ballistics experts were talking in court, they believed that the gunshots would have been audible for over a mile. Now, that sounds, incredible, doesn't it? The fact that you could hear it from over a mile away. But I think we also need to remember that we're looking at a very quiet evening, especially around this time of night. The snowfall, which was coming down intermittently throughout the evening. The roads would have been a lot less busy during this time if it was around midnight. So it would have been quite an eerily still, cold evening. What is also interesting about this statement is obviously the way in which this man describes what he's actually heard. The fact that he hasn't just heard 1 or 2 shots. He's heard a barrage of shots, a fusillade of shots being let off at around midnight on the evening of December the 6th. Now, even he mentions in his statement here that if he had heard 1 or 2 shots, he probably wouldn't have taken much notice. And this is something which is often brought up in the comment section to these videos. How could the person at Rettendon Hall not have heard the shots on the evening of December the 6th? How could the farmers at White House Farm not have heard the shots? How could any passing cars not have heard the shots? Any residents nearby? Simply, it's because in this area of countryside, shooting and hearing the sound of shooting was commonplace. Now, a lot of people find that hard to grasp. They find that concept hard to grasp. The fact that you could hear something and it really just not register that you've heard a particular sound because you're literally that used to hearing it. Now, to sort of deviate away from this story just for a few seconds, my nan actually lives, her back garden, I should say, backs on to the central line. So you hear trains going past every 3 or 4 minutes. Initially when you get there, you pay attention to them. You can hear the trains going past, you can see them, you hear the sound. But after, say, a few hours, you become so used to hearing it, you just don't take any notice of it. And I think that's what we're experiencing here when we look at some of the statements from local residents. They're so used to hearing this sound that it's nothing out of the ordinary. It's nothing that registers in their head as something unusual. Now, a few people will say, well, clearly Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were killed just before 7 p.m, as that's when their phones go out of action. That's when the phone calls stop coming, they stop answering their phone, they stop dialing people, etc., etc. And really that piece of evidence was used as kind of like a forensic key that they died at around 7 p.m, or just before, I should say. Now, although I can't go into hardly any detail regarding this, I believe that a new appeal or a ongoing appeal is focusing on these calls regarding Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. And there is some word, or some rumour I should say, that Pat Tate's phone was in use after 7 p.m. Now, I can't say that that is for sure, as I haven't seen the documents myself, but I certainly believe that there's a little bit more to this than meets the eye. What I can say with a fair deal of certainty is that Essex police have redacted a lot of the calls, or at least some of the calls, which Tucker, Tate and Rolfe received on December the 6th. Now, think of it from their perspective. They're trying to narrow down the calls which were made and received. They're trying to focus on Steele, Womes, Nicholls, Tate, Tucker, Rolfe, the girlfriends of those involved. But by all accounts, there are some calls which were either made or received near 7 p.m. on the evening of December the 6th, which were redacted by the Essex police. Now, that is the word that I am getting. As I say, I cannot confirm that, but that is what I have been told by a reliable source who is involved in this new appeal. Now, the reason that that statement is both applicable and interesting is the fact that it does tie in to some degree with Billy Jasper's version of events. The man who claims that he was the getaway driver that night, that he dropped off a single individual who climbed over a gate in Rectory Lane, or on Rectory Lane I should say, and then returned sort of 30 minutes to 45 minutes later with, I think it was 3 kilos of cocaine, having killed Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. Now, we know in the Range Rover there was an empty head bag. Could that have been what they were carrying that night? Could this explain the gunshots which were heard at around midnight? Does it also tie in with the fact that the Range Rover was found frost-free on the morning of December the 7th? The next statement comes from Michael Streliupton, dated the 10th of December 1995, where he states the following. I own and run Leppage's farm, situated at Rettendon Common, East Hanningfield Road. The farm is situated off the A130 main road. As part of my work, I deal with animals, and around 6 times a week I have cause to leave my farm and go and collect animal food. The place I go to collect the animal food is in North Woodham Bakeries, and I leave at around 19:30 hours to 19:45. On Wednesday, the 6th of the 12th, 95, I had to again go to North Woodham Bakeries to collect food for the animals. I recall having my evening meal that day at around 1900 hours, and after that I sorted out my vehicle to go and collect the food. I left in my Land Rover, index number CA27UKV, and went via a petrol station to fuel the vehicle and then on to North Woodham. The journey usually takes 20 minutes. However, on this occasion it took longer due to getting fuel and being delayed at the bakeries. However, I recall returning home to the farm at around 2100 to 21:30 hours, the exact time I cannot remember. It was around this time, whilst I was unloading the Land Rover, that I heard the sound of a rapid burst of gunfire coming from the area of Workhouse Lane. I was quite used to hearing gunfire coming from this area on Wednesdays, as this is a day that there are shoots in the fields and the surrounding area. However, I was quite surprised to hear the shots so late at night. I would describe the sound as either 2 or 3 shots being fired very closely together. Although I believe I heard the shots being fired at around 2100 to 21:30 hours when I had returned from the bakeries, it may have happened just before I left, at around 19:30 to 19:45 hours. I am able to remember this incident so well, as it was unusual to hear gunshots so late in the day. The shoots that occur on the Wednesday is clay pigeon shooting and runs the entire day until it gets dark. Now, this is a very interesting statement, particularly when you get a bit further down into it. Now, the reason I say that is because it's mentioned there, Wednesdays. Wednesday is the common day for shoots to occur at White House Farm and around the Workhouse Lane area. Now, he even says himself there, if he had heard these gunshots a bit earlier in the day, he wouldn't really have thought anything of it, because this was the common day. Wednesday was the common day for shoots to occur in that area. And I guess that's what I mean in my previous videos about this crime being particularly well planned in a lot of ways. Have they even gone down to such a minute detail as to choose the exact day which was common for shoots to occur in that area? Did whoever committed this crime have some kind of link or connection with that shooting club? What is telling me this statement is that whoever did this crime potentially had at least the knowledge that these gun shoots would take place on a Wednesday, the perfect day to commit a triple murder, the perfect day for these gunshots to blend in with the surrounding area. Interestingly, there was due to be a late evening, or I should say a late afternoon shoot at White House Farm on the afternoon of December the 6th, but this was for some reason cancelled. I remember reading a statement saying that they did shoot into the darkness, how they were able to do that was that they used floodlights. They used some kind of lighting outdoors in order for shoots to take place into the late afternoon. But for some reason on December the 6th, that shoot was cancelled. Now, I've just pulled up the statement from William Theobald, the brother of Peter Theobald, the farmer who discovered the bodies of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. And it's in his statement that he states the following: I currently only shoot on a Wednesday up until around 18:30 hours. On Wednesday, the 6th of the 12th, 95, the shooting stopped when it became too dark. I estimate the last shots were fired at around 15:45 hours. I do have lighting facilities to allow us to shoot after dark, but on the above date it was getting cold and the last visitor had an interest in our lakes, so we went to discuss my pond, which is beside my home. So that's interesting there. Just to have a picture of that in your mind. There were people there shooting just a few hundred yards from where the Range Rover was discovered, just a couple of hours potentially before Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were murdered, 2 or 3 hours before this triple murder took place. That's quite, not odd, but it's quite a sort of eerie thing to actually think about. The final statement comes from David Gibbons, dated the 10th of December 1995, where he states the following: I reside at the address given with my family. I own an upholstery business which is situated at Old Hall Farm, The Barns, A130 at Rettendon, Essex. The premises consist of a breeze block type construction. There are no windows in the building, but there is a main door 6'6" by 8. This building is about 50 yards from the main A130 road. It is about the same distance to where the police have sealed the entrance to a small lane recently. On Wednesday, the 6th of the 12th, 95, I was at work in company with my wife Sarah. I had started work at 7 a.m. My wife joined me later in the day. I'm not sure of the exact time, but it was late afternoon or early evening when I heard the sound of gunshots. My wife had just gone out to fill some water containers from a nearby tap. The door of my building was closed at this time, and as she opened the door on her return, I heard 3 shots in quick succession. I remarked to my wife saying, "It's a bit late for shooting." I didn't take any notice of this and I carried on working. I think the time of the shots may have been around 1800 hours. I say this because I was buttoning settees. I normally take around 2 hours to do each settee. I was on my 3rd one, and having started doing this around midday, I can only put the time as around that period. It's not uncommon to hear gunshots in that area, because there is a clay shoot and also quite a few individuals shoot game in the area. I do not recall seeing anyone in the area of the barn, and I can say that apart from my wife and I, there were no other people working there. My wife and I are the only people that use the barns, apart from the landlord David O'Callaghan of Ivanhurst Limited, South Woodham Ferrers. Okay, so certainly a very interesting statement there, and one which I guess really could tie in with the official supposed version of events for the evening of December the 6th. Now, the reason I say that is because this guy is quite vague in his timings here. He's really just going by how long it usually takes him to do his work or complete his work. So could it be that it wasn't actually 6 p.m. that he hears these shots, but more like 6:45 or just before 7 p.m. I think that's actually quite likely. What's also worthy of mention is the fact that this guy appears to be situated quite close to Workhouse Lane. This is really the only statement that I've read to you out of these three which could tie in with, as I say, the official supposed version of events for the evening of December the 6th. Many thanks for joining me for today's video. Shortly when the outro starts, you'll be able to see some other videos from the channel and also the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos concerning this case in one convenient folder. Thanks so much for joining me for today's video. I look forward to seeing you again in the next one. Take care. Cheers.